We learn in school that World War I began with 2 shots in Sarajevo, that a single assassination triggered a cascade of entanglements, and that the war was an unfortunate accident of alliances. That is the tidy story for children, dramatic, simple, morally neat. It leaves out the grubby, structural forces that made mass slaughter possible, the geopolitics of trade, credit, and rails. If you want to understand why millions died in muddy trenches and why the modern Middle East looks the way it does, you have to look beyond Gavrilo Princip's pistol. You have to look at maps from 1900 and spot the thing that terrified the British Empire more than any rival fleet or army. It was not a gun, it was a railway. This is the story of the Berlin-Baghdad line, the iron road that promised to stitch the industrial heart of Europe to the energy and raw materials of the Middle East, and in doing so, threatened to reroute the balance of commercial and strategic power. It is also the story of how the Ottoman leadership tried to escape financial dependence on London and Paris, only to stride into a geopolitical trap whose consequences would rip the empire to pieces. Begin with the world as it stood around 1900. Britain was the globe's hegemon. Its dominance sat on 2 pillars, naval supremacy and the Suez Canal. The Royal Navy closed the seas. The canal shortened distances to India. Control of Suez meant control of the fastest route to the jewel of the empire. If you were a German exporter or a Russian silks merchant bound for Bombay or Shanghai, you had to negotiate British sea lanes and the politics that enforced them. Germany, after 1871, was an industrial dynamo. Its engineers and factories were outproducing many rivals, and German science led in chemistry and engineering. But Germany lacked a global colonial system on the scale of Britain's. It had no guaranteed sources of certain commodities and no overseas empire that automatically funneled raw materials into its industry. Worse, from a geostrategic viewpoint, Germany was landlocked by potential adversaries and faced the Royal Navy as the gatekeeper of the world's maritime commerce. The great anxiety in Berlin was strategic isolation. Germany could produce more, but how to get it to distant markets without being constrained by British control of the sea? To the southeast lay the Ottoman Empire. For centuries it had been a great power. By the late 19th century, it was the sick man of Europe. It lost wars and territories, its administrative apparatus was corroded, and it had run structural deficits for decades. Crucially, the port was indebted to Western financiers. A default in 1881 had effectively handed large slices of Ottoman fiscal sovereignty to the European creditors through the Ottoman Public Debt Administration. In practice, taxes on key items, salt, tobacco, some customs revenues, were earmarked for European bondholders. Much of the state's revenue never flowed freely into Ottoman coffers, it flowed into bank vaults abroad. That diminished sovereignty was a source of humiliation and strategic vulnerability. Sultan Abdulhamid II and his circle understood they were being squeezed by foreign capital. They wanted to modernize, to build railways, telegraphs, and a modern army, but they did not want to depend on London and Paris to finance and build the instruments of modernization, because dependence would only tighten the creditor's grip. The solution, from the Ottoman perspective, was to diversify patrons, to accept German capital and engineering instead. For Berlin, the offer represented an irresistible strategic opportunity. Imagine the geometry, a continuous rail link running southeast from Central Europe, crossing the Balkans into Anatolia, piercing the Taurus Range, threading across Mesopotamia, modern Iraq, and reaching the Persian Gulf. A train carrying German-manufactured goods could cross Eurasia and reach the Indian Ocean without mustering a single British ship. That overland route would be a political and commercial bypass of the British maritime choke points, and, perhaps more ominously for London, a way to project German influence directly to the resource-rich and increasingly oil-promising lands east of the Ottoman core. Deutsche Bank and German industrial syndicates took the lead in financing and technical organization. Engineers laid track through mountains and deserts. They negotiated concessions and drilled into regions that had been geopolitically marginal. The concessionary architecture, the rights that German companies and syndicates obtained on the Anatolian Railway and later for the Baghdad extension, gave them control over construction and certain economic privileges along the route. To many British strategic thinkers, the railway was less a railway than a dagger aimed at the empire's flank. Why did this provoke such an existential panic in London? Two reasons: trade and oil. Trade is obvious. An uninterrupted overland route could permit German goods to flood markets that British merchants assumed to be secure. More consequential in the decades to come was oil. At the turn of the century, oil was already revealing itself as the fuel that would power navies, industry, and eventually mechanized armies. Admiral John Fisher's advocacy for oil-powered ships crystallized a new axiom: naval power's future would rest on petroleum, not coal. Britain had major coal resources at home, but oil deposits were elsewhere: in Persia, Iran, in Mesopotamia, and later in the Caucasus. Geologists and oil companies were piecing together an enormous potential in the lands the railway would cross. German interests that obtained minimal and concessionary rights for lands adjacent to the proposed track, concessions typically extended a certain number of kilometers on each side of the line, were therefore not merely investors in a transportation project. They were positioning to control access to an energy hinterland that might determine the fuel supply of future fleets. If Germany could secure oil supplies that were effectively linked to Berlin by rail, Britain's strategic reliance on seaborne sources that could be interdicted would be gravely altered. London responded in several ways. Diplomacy was the first line of defense. The British government used treaties, secret understandings, and pressure to constrain where the railway could terminate and how neighboring sheiks might contract with foreign powers. The tiny sheikdom on the Persian Gulf's northern littoral, Kuwait, eventually signed agreements that limited its ability to lease territory or grant ports to other powers without British consent. That move effectively denied a fully open seaward terminus for non-British interests. In parallel, the City of London made political and financial moves designed to limit British investment in the railway, but to retain influence over the region through alternative lines of credit and company structures. London also mobilized propaganda and geopolitical pressure. Newspapers framed the Ottoman administration as corrupt and German involvement as an instrument of expansionism. That public narrative helped justify diplomatic and eventually military interventions. Financial levers, credit, underwriting, and access to markets were pressed as well. The British used the full toolkit of imperial statecraft: treaties, influence over local rulers, naval presence, and economic pressure. By 1914, the rails had advanced far, across Anatolia and toward the Mesopotamian plains, and alarm in London was acute. In that pre-war context, Europe's rivalries were not only about prestige or dynastic quarrels in the Balkans, they were about competing economic geometries. Who would control the arteries of trade and the taps of raw material supply? The Triple Entente formed, in part, as an anti-German counterweight. France and Russia had their reasons to worry about German industrial reach, while Britain worried for Suez and India. When the guns began firing in 1914, the Middle East was immediately seen in London and Paris as a strategic theater, not merely a peripheral front. The British sent an expeditionary column to Basra in November 1914, Indian Expeditionary Force D, officially to protect oil facilities, notably the refinery at Abadan on the Shatt al-Arab just upriver from Basra, and to guard the Persian Gulf. But strategically, the movement was also about preventing German or Ottoman control over Mesopotamian oil fields and the transport corridors that would connect them to the sea. The unfinished Baghdad Railway was part of the operational map. Whoever controlled the lines and the adjacent oil fields controlled future options for strategic mobility and energy security. The Mesopotamian campaign was grim and often chaotic. Heat, disease, and logistical difficulty made it a brutal theater. Early British setbacks, notably the Siege of Kut 1915 to 1916, where a British Indian force was encircled and surrendered after a protracted siege, demonstrated that control of the region was neither easy nor quick. Yet the Ottomans could not convert distant rail gains into decisive strategic advantages. The railway itself was incomplete and vulnerable. Gaps in the mountainous sections forced the movement of war material by road, by camel, and by human porterage. Those choke points starved Ottoman forces of the sustainment they needed. If the line had been complete years earlier, the strategic calculus might have been different. In the event, the British were able to consolidate, push north, and eventually, in 1917, capture Baghdad and exert control over Mesopotamia's oil resources. While armies fought, diplomats drew maps with pencils. In the middle of the war, Britain and France negotiated the post-war division of Ottoman possessions. The secret Sykes-Picot Correspondence 1915–16 and the subsequent understandings encoded imperial designs. Strategic access trumped local loyalties. The lines drawn by Sir Mark Sykes and François-Georges Picot did not follow ethnic, tribal, or sectarian logics. They mapped the intersection of existing infrastructure, economic interests, notably oil, and imperial buffers. The tracks and the known locations of oil deposits strongly influenced the partitioning. Mandates and protectorates would later overlay these lines, creating new political architectures that often disregarded historic social boundaries. Promises made during war exacerbated the betrayal. The British had encouraged Arab revolts against Ottoman rule, personified in the figure of T.E. Lawrence, with words implying eventual independence. Arab uprisings helped sabotage Ottoman rail links and undermined imperial control. After victory, however, the promise of sovereignty was sidestepped. Britain and France cemented mandates in the Levant and Mesopotamia. The Ottoman imperial order was dismantled. The caliphate and sultanate were abolished. The old debts were not simply forgotten. The financial arrangements that had subordinated Ottoman revenues to European bondholders metamorphosed into new structures in the mandates and successor states. Colonial administrations and concessionary companies, notably oil syndicates, assumed dominant roles in resource extraction and transport networks. Once in control of the region, the Western powers reoriented strategic tools toward pipelines and controlled port facilities rather than a unified rail corridor open to rival powers. The Iraq Petroleum Company, a consortium dominated by British, French, Dutch, and eventually American interests, moved to build pipelines, for example from Kirkuk to the Mediterranean, enabling oil to reach markets under Western control without relying on trans-Eurasian rail lines that could empower continental rivals. Pipelines were easier to secure, easier to control economically, and less likely to carry passengers or ideas that threatened imperial order. The political logic was straightforward: keep the flow, sever the connections that unify. The Baghdad Railway's incomplete dream cast a long shadow. In the 1930s and 40s, the presence of oil and transport corridors again became theaters of contest. Nazi Germany eyed Eastern resources. During World War II, the Axis sought access to Caucasian and Mesopotamian oil. In 1941, pro-Nazi anti-British uprisings in Iraq briefly threatened British control, and London re-intervened militarily to ensure British geopolitical interests in the Gulf. World War II reiterated the lesson: whoever holds the energy nodes and the transport corridors can shape strategic outcomes. After 1945, the imperial mantle shifted. Britain emerged exhausted and indebted. The United States became the dominant external power. Washington adopted many of the same strategic preoccupations. Access to oil and control of key choke points became central to U.S. policy. The Cold War's grand strategic frame, NATO, containment and alliance building, was at least partly about ensuring that Eurasian land bridges and adjacent energy fields could not be monopolized by a hostile continental power. Turkey was integrated into NATO not only because of its political orientation, but also because of its geography, a bridge between Europe and Asia that controls key straits and routes. Fast forward to the present, and the parallels are striking. In the 21st century, a new continental power, China, is building overland links and maritime networks under the label of the Belt and Road Initiative, or BRI. From Beijing's perspective, the logic echoes the old reasoning that led to the Baghdad Railway. If you are a manufacturing giant reliant on imported energy and seaborne trade, you are vulnerable to interdiction at sea in wartime or coercive diplomacy in peace. Diversifying supply lines and creating integrated overland and maritime corridors reduces that vulnerability. High-speed rail, pipelines, ports, and fiber-optic routes knit China to Europe, Central Asia, South Asia, and Africa. The map of these investments looks, in a strategic sense, like an updated and far broader version of the old Berlin-Baghdad concept. Unsurprisingly, that revival has induced anxiety among the existing maritime hegemon. Analyses and rhetoric from Washington and allied capitals highlight debt-trap diplomacy, state influence, and the security implications of foreign control over critical infrastructure. The vocabulary feels familiar. Accusations of predatory finance, concerns about ports, cables, and energy pipelines, and lobbying campaigns aimed at restricting strategic investments. Geopolitics has not changed its grammar, it has adapted its tools. The Baghdad Railway episode offers a clear lesson. Infrastructure is not neutral. Roads, rails, pipelines, and ports are vectors of economic power and therefore of political leverage. The Ottoman attempt to leverage German finance and technology to break free of Paris and London's fiscal dominance looked, from a narrow political perspective, like emancipation. From a wider perspective, it meant that the empire's territory became the stage for a struggle among great powers. Inviting a rival to build your arteries can convert your homeland into strategic terrain. Today, many states face analogous choices. Development requires capital, expertise, and networks. China offers both quickly and at scale. Western governments warn against dependency. The states deciding whether to accept offers of infrastructure finance are rational actors balancing immediate needs against long-term sovereignty trade-offs. The historical pattern is stark. Strategic geography plus external investment makes local politics vulnerable to great power rivalry. If you dig under the narratives of sectarian strife and ancient hatreds that often dominate headlines about the Middle East, you will find material artifacts of those earlier struggles: railway sleepers, pipeline routes, concession maps. The iron tracks that never fulfilled their promise still mark lines that shaped the 20th century's conflicts and that continue to influence political calculations today. The collapse of the Ottoman Empire did not occur because of a single assassin's shot. It was the outcome of embedded economic dependencies, the geopolitics of infrastructure and resource control, and the strategic rivalries of industrial states. The Berlin-Baghdad project embodied an alternative modernity, one that would have knitted Asia to Europe by land and could have redistributed economic power away from maritime empires. It was a disruptive project and therefore a target. History does not unfold in tidy narratives. It is the accumulation of investments, concessions, and strategic bets. The railway that never fully ran the whole distance did not simply vanish as an octogenarian curiosity. It reshaped the regional map, contributed to the dismantling of an empire, and provided the connective logic for 20th century interventions. The patterns that produced that outcome are visible again when a dominant power perceives a rival's infrastructure project as a strategic threat. It will use diplomacy, finance, propaganda, and, if necessary, force to constrain that rival. That is an old geopolitical logic playing out with new actors and new technologies. If you disagree with this reading, explain where. Was it not oil and transport that made Mesopotamia strategic, or did personality and miscalculation matter more than structural economics? If you accept the argument, then consider what that implies for contemporary policy choices around infrastructure finance and geopolitical competition. The same maps that once spooked London would worry Beijing today, and the same geographies that made empires fight before are powering new economic rivalries now. I'm John. This is the Documentary History Hub. If you follow these patterns where you live, in corridors of power, in financing deals, and in diplomatic rhetoric, you can see the long arc of history bending into the present. Empires rarely fall in the way newspapers dramatize. They erode where financial flows, transport lines, and strategic access meet. The Berlin-Baghdad line was not merely an engineering project, it was an idea about who should feed and power the modern world. It never fully ran its course, but its consequences did. If you found this exploration useful, subscribe. If you think I've missed something important, leave a comment. Disagreement is how we sharpen the story. History is written through argument as much as through archives.